Medical care is inherently chaotic. A patient encounter generates a storm of symptoms, test results, and narrative notes, all recorded in the highly variable language of human providers. To process this, the healthcare system requires a mechanism to translate that clinical chaos into a perfect geometric grid of data. You cannot process this raw output by guessing or approximating the physician's intent. ICD-10-CM functions as a rigid diagnostic programming language governed by absolute syntactical rules. As a medical coder, your professional boundary is strictly defined. Your role is to translate the provider's explicit documentation into this structured language. You are not responsible for validating whether the diagnosis meets clinical criteria. You do not use lab values or isolated test results to independently alter or assume a condition. The absolute baseline rule of input is simple. If the provider's diagnostic statement documents it, you code it exactly as stated. Mastering this algorithmic syntax is the only way to convert highly variable clinical narratives into mathematically precise, valid alphanumeric data strings. Every valid diagnosis code is generated through a mandatory two-step algorithm: find and define. Step 1 begins in the alphabetic index. This acts exclusively as your search interface to locate a potential code path based on the provider's exact terminology. Step 2 requires you to move to the tabular list. This is the mandatory verification directory, where you confirm the code's structural validity and check for binding instructional notes. Bypassing the tabular list verification step and assigning a code directly from the index guarantees a structural failure of your code. This diagram shows the physical architecture of a diagnostic code. It operates as a rigid array containing up to 7 distinct character slots. The first 3 slots represent the base category, providing the foundational framework for the condition. Slots 4 and 5 contain the subcategory, which adds deeper clinical specificity, such as anatomic site or severity. The 6th and 7th slots form the final code, representing the absolute limit of precision available in the system. Certain categories, specifically injuries or fractures, carry a strict system requirement for a 7th character to indicate parameters like the episode of care or healing status. To meet this requirement when earlier subcategory slots are empty, the algorithm uses the letter X as a structural placeholder. If you omit the X placeholder, the 7th character shifts into the wrong slot, instantly rendering the entire data string invalid. Establishing this flawless physical architecture, the verified 7-character array, is the mandatory prerequisite before any relational logic can be applied to the diagnosis. In a clinical setting, documentation frequently lacks the exact specificity that the coding architecture demands. This matrix illustrates how the system mathematically processes missing information using 2 specific logic operators, NEC and NOS. NEC, or not elsewhere classifiable, is used when the provider's documentation is highly specific, but the database lacks a corresponding unique node for that exact condition. NEC represents a system limitation. It forces you to select an other specified code to capture the clinical detail without breaking the classification structure. NOS, or not otherwise specified, is used when the system has deeper subcategories available, but the provider's documentation is too vague to use them. Art demonstrates manifestation sequencing. Notice how the bracket punctuation and the alphabetic index physically forces the second code into a subordinate position. The absolute rule here is that a bracketed code represents a manifestation. It must always follow the underlying etiology code and can never be listed first on a claim. Another core directive is the word with, which acts as a relational logic tie between 2 conditions. When the manual uses with, it establishes a legally presumed causal relationship. This bypasses the need for the provider to explicitly link the conditions in their notes. The algorithm links them automatically. To prevent logical contradictions, the system uses excludes notes as operators for mutual exclusivity. Excludes one is a hard barrier. It dictates that the listed conditions are mutually exclusive and absolutely cannot be coded together under any circumstances. Excludes 2 creates a parallel track. It indicates the condition is not included in the primary code, but both can coexist and be coded simultaneously if the documentation supports it. Finally, the word AND within a code total functions strictly as an AND/OR operator. It allows the code to be assigned whether one, the other, or both conditions are present. These syntax directives form an automated logic gate that prevents sequencing errors and enforces a universal standard of reporting, regardless of an individual coder's clinical assumptions. This master pipeline visualization shows how a messy clinical event translates into clean data. The index search connects to tabular verification, filters through NEC and NOS operators, passes syntax directive gates, and outputs a complete 7-character array. Accurate coding is simply the result of moving step by step through this rigid logic structure. But this algorithm is only as valid as the data fed into it, which brings us to the hierarchy of who provides the input. The core diagnosis must absolutely originate from the patient's primary provider. There is a strict exception for supplementary data. Coders can utilize specific metrics documented by secondary clinicians, such as nurses or EMTs. This applies to specific data points like body mass index values or coma scale scores, where the clinician is capturing a measurement rather than establishing a diagnosis. The restriction on this secondary data is absolute. It can only be used to generate secondary codes, never the principal diagnosis. Utilizing ICD-10-CM as a system of relational logic empowers coders to eliminate guesswork, survive audits, and capture the exact clinical reality of every encounter.